The smoke was the first lie the prairie told him that morning, thin as thread, rising from a place where no fire should be. Caleb Hart reined in on a low rise and stared toward the creek line, his breath catching as if the wind had reached inside his chest. He hadn't seen another soul out there in weeks, not this far from town, not on the ragged edge of his land where the grass grew tough and the sky felt too close. He should have turned around. He knew that. Out here, curiosity could become trouble, and trouble always found a way to crawl back to town and grow teeth. But his horse stood patient beneath him, ears forward, and Caleb stayed frozen, watching the pale ribbon of smoke drift and break apart. Down by the water, a young woman moved with a careful urgency. She was alone. No wagon, no mule, no extra hands. A scatter of unusable boards lay in a heap near the bank, warped, split, some with old nails bent sideways. She pulled one free, tested it, and winced when the wood flexed. Then she set it against two others in a crooked triangle and tied the corners with strips of canvas that looked like they'd been torn from a feed sack. The wind pushed at the makeshift walls. The whole thing shuddered. She steadied it with her shoulder without a word, jaw clenched, eyes fixed on the task like the prairie itself had dared her to quit. Caleb watched for the usual signs: a glance over the shoulder, a raised hand, a call for help. He saw none of it. She didn't plead with the empty air. She didn't look up to see if anyone was watching. She worked as if dignity could be nailed into place, board by board, even when every board was wrong. That was what held him there. Not the shelter, not the smoke, the refusal. She knelt in the mud and drove a stake down with a rock, her hands shaking from effort or cold. The hem of her dress was dark with creek water. A strand of hair had come loose and stuck to her cheek. She brushed it away and kept going, even after the stake slipped and scraped her palm. She paused only long enough to press her hand against her skirt and breathe once, slow and controlled, like she was swallowing a sound she refused to make. Caleb told himself it was none of his business. A man alone on a ranch drew enough talk as it was. Since Mary's passing, he had learned how quickly the town filled quiet spaces with stories. If folks saw a woman near his property line, they'd decide what it meant before they ever asked what was true. And he had no patience left for their guesses. He shifted in the saddle, the worn leather creaking. For a moment he pictured his house, clean, solid, empty. The front room where Mary's sewing basket used to sit. The kitchen table with one chair pushed in and the other left out, like a mistake he kept forgetting to fix. He had been moving through his days like a man balancing on broken boards, stepping carefully so nothing snapped loud enough for him to hear. Down at the creek, the woman lifted another plank and tried to wedge it into the frame. It didn't fit. She pulled it back, studied the split, and set it aside with a strange gentleness, like she couldn't afford to waste anger on things that were already ruined. Caleb's throat tightened with an old memory he didn't invite. Mary at the window during a spring storm, watching the clouds pile up, saying, "If someone's out there with nowhere to go, we won't pretend we didn't see." Back then, those words had sounded simple. After she was gone, they felt like a weight he had no strength to carry. He glanced along the fence line, thinking of the day ahead. Ranch hands would ride out later. Someone would notice tracks near the creek. Someone would talk. And once the town started talking, it didn't stop until it had taken what it wanted. Pride, peace, reputation, sometimes hope. The woman stepped back from her shelter and tested it with both hands. The roof sagged, a gust lifted one side, and she lunged to catch it, nearly falling into the grass. She recovered fast, cheeks flushed, eyes bright with stubborn anger. Not at Caleb, not at anyone watching, but at the simple fact that the world kept making everything harder than it had to be. Caleb felt the pull then, sharp and unwelcome, like a hand closing around his wrist. He could ride away and let the prairie decide her fate. He could tell himself she chose this and that he owed her nothing. He could keep his life clean of complications and quiet of questions. But he didn't move. He sat there watching her square her shoulders and start again. And something in him, something he thought grief had buried for good, shifted and woke. He understood, with a certainty that made his stomach go cold, that she would not survive out there if nothing changed. And for the first time in years, his conscience spoke louder than his fear of what people might say. By the time Caleb turned his horse back toward the ranch, the sun was higher and the wind had sharpened. He rode with his jaw set, as if he could press the doubt down by force. Helping her would not be simple. It would not be private. It would not be the kind of kindness you could offer once and then forget. He knew that, and still he kept going. The ranch came into view like it always did. Barn, corrals, a line of cottonwoods bent by years of weather. The place looked steady from the outside. Caleb felt anything but steady inside. He swung down at the hitching rail and stood for a moment with one hand on the saddle, listening to the ordinary sounds. A gate chain clinking, a horse snorting, a far-off hammer from the shop. Normal life. The kind he used to share with Mary. The kind that now moved around him without touching him. "Boss?" His foreman, Eli Rourke, stepped out of the barn doorway. Eli was lean, graying at the temples, the sort of man who noticed everything and said very little. "You're back early." Caleb nodded once. He wanted to keep this simple. No explanations. No openings for questions. "Need some lumber pulled from the stack. Good boards." Eli lifted an eyebrow. "For what job?" Caleb felt the pause like heat on his neck. "Repair." Eli didn't argue, but his eyes stayed on Caleb's face a second longer than usual. "All right. How much?" "Enough for a small shelter," Caleb said before he could stop himself. Eli's mouth tightened, not in anger, but in understanding. He didn't ask the next question out loud. Instead, he said, "I'll tell the boys to load it in the wagon." "No wagon," Caleb replied. He cleared his throat. "I'll take it on horseback. Quiet." Eli's gaze flicked to the ranch hands nearby. Two men were pitching hay. Another was carrying a bucket toward the trough. They weren't listening, but they could start. Eli lowered his voice. "That's going to be hard to keep quiet." "I know," Caleb said. Eli hesitated, then nodded once. "I'll help you choose the boards. And some nails." Caleb walked into the barn, the familiar smell of hay and leather wrapping around him. He had spent so much time in here since Mary's passing, not because he had to, but because the barn felt easier than the house. In the barn, work had rules. In the house, memory did. They went to the lumber stack. The good boards were straight and dry, the kind you saved for a real project. Caleb ran his hand along the grain of one plank and thought of the woman's shelter shaking in the wind. He thought of her hands, scraped and red, trying to force broken wood to behave. Eli set aside several boards and spoke like he was talking about the weather. "You'll want a tarp, too. Nights are cold." Caleb swallowed. "Yes." They gathered nails, a hammer, a small bundle of rope, and a plain canvas tarp. Caleb added a water skin without thinking, then paused, surprised by his own impulse. He told himself it was practical. Nothing more. As he tied the boards into a careful load, his mind kept trying to turn back. He could still choose not to do this. He could tell Eli to put everything back. He could ride into town instead and let someone else deal with it. He could stay out of it entirely. Then Mary's face came to him the way it sometimes did, without warning, clear as day, as if she had stepped into the barn and was standing beside him. Not smiling, not accusing, just there. He remembered the last winter they had together, when a neighbor's roof had partly blown off. Mary had bundled up and marched Caleb outside before he'd finished his coffee. "Someone's in trouble," she'd said, and that was the whole reason. No lecture, no debate, just a simple truth. Caleb tightened the final knot until the rope bit into his palm. His chest ached, not like a wound, but like a door opening after years of being stuck. He didn't know if helping this woman would bring him back to life or break him further. He only knew he could not unsee what he had seen. When he stepped outside, the afternoon light made the yard look washed and wide. One of the ranch hands, a young man named Tom, glanced up from his work. "Heading out again, Mr. Hart?" Caleb kept his voice even. "Fence line." Tom nodded, but his eyes drifted to the load on Caleb's horse. Caleb felt the first prick of risk, the first hint that this would travel beyond the ranch whether he wanted it to or not. Eli walked with him to the rail and handed him the hammer. "You sure about this?" he asked softly, so only Caleb could hear. Caleb took the hammer and met his foreman's eyes. "No," he said, "but I'm doing it anyway." Eli exhaled through his nose, then stepped back. "Then ride smart." Caleb swung into the saddle, the boards shifting under the rope. He guided his horse toward the back road that cut through low grass and avoided the main path to town. Each hoofbeat felt like a choice he couldn't take back. He rode toward the creek, with the weight of good lumber behind him, and the heavier weight of what it meant pressing down on his shoulders. Somewhere ahead, a woman was still trying to build a life from scraps, and Caleb was crossing a line he had guarded for years, between keeping safe and doing what he knew was right. The creek sounded different up close, louder than it had from the rise. Water moved around stones with a steady patience, like it had all the time in the world. Caleb guided his horse through the tall grass and stopped a short distance away, careful not to rush in and startle her. The woman was bent over the crooked frame of her shelter, pulling a strip of canvas tight with both hands. Her shoulders were tense, her focus locked on the knot. She noticed him only when his horse snorted. In one quick motion, she straightened and stepped back, putting the shelter between them like a thin shield. Her chin lifted. Her eyes were wary, but not pleading. Caleb raised one hand, palm out, keeping his voice calm. "I'm not here to cause trouble." She didn't answer right away. Her gaze flicked to the boards strapped behind his saddle, then back to his face. "That depends," she said, steady and low, "on what you call trouble." He respected that. "Fair," he replied. "My name is Caleb Hart. This land is mine." He nodded toward the load. "I brought better materials." Her lips pressed together. Pride flashed in her expression, sharp as a match. "I didn't ask for anything." "I know," Caleb said. "That's why I noticed you." For a moment, only the creek spoke. The wind lifted the edge of her canvas roof and let it fall again with a sad slap. She swallowed once, as if tasting words she didn't want to say. "What do you want in return?" she asked. Caleb shook his head. "Nothing. You can say no. I'll ride out, and you won't see me again." Her eyes stayed on him, searching. She looked tired in a way that went deeper than sleep, but she held herself like someone used to finishing what she started. Finally, she stepped aside and gave a small nod toward the ground. Not welcome. Not gratitude. Just permission. "If you're going to do it," she said, "do it fast. Weather turns out here." Caleb dismounted and began untying the rope. He worked without stepping too close, letting her keep space. When he handed her a straight board, she hesitated, then took it with both hands like it weighed more than wood. They started with the base, laying 2 boards level and pushing stones underneath to keep them from sinking into wet soil. Caleb showed her how to brace corners with shorter pieces, how to angle supports so the wind had less to grab. He talked only when needed. She watched closely, then copied him without complaint. "What's your name?" he asked after a while. She paused, wiping her forehead with the back of her wrist. "Anna," she said. After a beat, she added, "Anna Doyle." Caleb nodded and went back to work, letting the name settle. It sounded plain, American, like it belonged in a ledger or on a mailbox. But something in her voice made him think she had not said it aloud in a long time. They drove stakes, tightened rope, and set the first real wall. The structure began to stand on its own. When the wind came again, the boards held. Anna stared at it as if she didn't trust the change. "You've done this before," she said, watching Caleb set nails with steady hands. "Ranch teaches you," he replied. "And grief?" she asked suddenly, too direct to be polite. Caleb's hand stopped mid-swing. He slowly lowered the hammer. The question hit the exact place he kept guarded, the place he rarely let anyone see. Anna's face tightened as if she regretted it at once. "Sorry," she said quick. "Forget I said it." But Caleb couldn't. He looked at her, really looked, and saw the same hollow he felt in himself. Not weakness. A missing piece. "My wife," he said, the words rough in his throat, "passed a few years back." Anna's eyes softened, just a little. "Then you know," she said. "The world keeps moving like nothing happened." Caleb didn't answer, because his mouth wouldn't form it. He turned back to the boards, but his hands were less steady now. As they worked, the shelter grew into something solid enough to call a room. A tarp roof stretched tight. The doorway faced away from the wind. Inside, the ground was covered with dry grass and a layer of canvas. Caleb didn't do it for her. He did it with her. When she struggled with a knot, he showed her once and let her finish it herself. When he lifted a heavy board, she braced the other end without being asked. Halfway through, Caleb reached into his saddlebag for nails, and his fingers closed around something else. A small cloth bundle he hadn't meant to bring. He froze, then pulled it out by mistake. A faded blue ribbon lay inside, neatly folded, along with a pressed wildflower gone flat and brown. Anna noticed. Her eyes went to the bundle, and then to his face. Caleb's chest tightened. He had kept that ribbon in his coat since the day Mary wore it in her hair at a summer dance. He told himself he carried it because it was harmless, because it was all he had left that still felt warm. Seeing it in his hand out here, in front of a stranger, made him feel exposed in a way he hadn't expected. He started to shove it back into the bag, embarrassed, but Anna reached out, not to touch it, just to stop him from hiding it. "Don't," she said quietly. "If you keep it buried, it eats you alive." Caleb stared at her, shocked by the truth of it. The moral choice in that moment wasn't about wood or shelter. It was about whether he would keep living as a closed door or risk being seen again. He put the bundle back gently, not like a secret, but like something real. Then he picked up the hammer, his grip firmer. By late afternoon, the shelter stood straight and strong, a simple square with a solid roof and braced corners. Anna stepped inside and looked around, as if the space might vanish if she blinked. She exhaled slowly, and her shoulders dropped for the first time. "Thank you," she said. The words strained as if they cost her. Caleb nodded once. "You did most of it." Anna looked at him then, truly looked, and there was no softness in it that belonged to pity. It was respect, the kind you give someone who works beside you and doesn't look away. The prairie stretched wide around them, still lonely, still harsh, but the shelter changed the shape of that loneliness. It was no longer just a hiding place. It was the first sign that something could be built here without shame, and without either of them pretending they didn't need anyone. Word of Anna Doyle did not arrive in town like a report. It arrived like a smile shared across a counter, like a pause that lasted half a second too long, like a name spoken softly so it could travel farther. Caleb felt it the first time he rode in for supplies. He tied his horse outside the general store and stepped onto the boardwalk. Conversations did not stop, but they thinned. Eyes lifted and slid away. Mrs. Daly, who usually greeted him by name, looked at the flour sacks instead of his face. Inside, the store smelled of coffee, soap, and leather. The clerk, a young man with slick hair and careful manners, greeted him with a bright tone that did not reach his eyes. "Morning, Mr. Hart. Fine day, isn't it?" Caleb nodded and kept moving, gathering what he needed. Nails, lamp oil, coffee, a bolt of plain cloth. When he reached the counter, the clerk rang the items slowly, like he had all day. "Busy week," the clerk said, still smiling. "Seems like folks are noticing a few things out your way." Caleb met his gaze. Noticing what? The clerk gave a small shrug, polite and empty. "Oh, you know how people are. They worry. They talk. They mean well." He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice as if sharing a friendly tip. "A woman on her own can draw the wrong kind of attention, especially when she's near a respectable man." Caleb's jaw tightened. "I'm buying supplies," he said, "not opinions." The clerk's smile stayed in place. "Of course. No offense meant. None at all." Caleb paid and left. On the street, he saw two women near the church steps, heads close together. One of them glanced at him, then at the bundle under his arm, then away again. The message was clear without a single word. They had already decided what the story was. He rode to the bank next, because ranch life ran on credit as much as cattle. The building was solid and neat, with clean windows and a polished door. Inside, the air smelled like ink and money. Mr. Whitcomb, the banker, rose from behind his desk with practiced warmth. "Mr. Hart," Whitcomb said, voice smooth as butter. "Always a pleasure. Please sit." Caleb stayed standing. "I'm here about the note coming due." Whitcomb clasped his hands, friendly and calm. "Naturally. We can handle it. We've always valued your reliability." His smile widened a touch. "A man of your standing is important to this town." Caleb watched him closely. "Get to the point." Whitcomb's eyes flicked just briefly toward the closed office door, as if making sure no one else was listening. "People have concerns," he said gently, like he was discussing a sick calf. "It's not my place to judge. I only manage risk." Caleb felt heat rise in his chest. "Risk." Whitcomb nodded, still polite. "Of course. If your judgment is questioned, some may wonder what else is uncertain." He spread his hands, as if he were offering help. "I would hate to see you face unnecessary difficulty. Perhaps this situation could be resolved quickly, quietly." Caleb's voice turned flat. "You're saying my loan depends on me doing what you think looks proper." Whitcomb chuckled softly, like Caleb had made a joke. "Not at all. I'm saying appearances matter. They always have, and I would be glad to advise you as a friend." Caleb leaned forward, then advised the town to mind its own business. The banker's smile held, but his eyes cooled. "I only advise what is practical." Caleb left the bank with his stomach tight and his mind clearer than it had been in years. This was not about money. It was about control. People wanted the world to stay the way they liked it, even if someone suffered to make that happen. That evening, he found Anna at the shelter site, folding the edge of the tarp with careful hands. She looked up the moment she saw his face. "It started," she said quietly. Caleb set down the supplies. "Yes." Anna's throat moved as she swallowed. "I can leave," she said. "I can go before it hurts your ranch, your credit, your name. I won't be the reason they take things from you." Caleb stared at her. For a second, he saw what she was offering: an easy exit, a clean story, a return to the numb quiet he had lived in since Mary. It would protect him. It would also confirm every cruel thought the town was already feeding itself. "No," he said. Anna's eyes shone, but she held her voice steady. "You don't owe me." "I know what I owe," Caleb cut in, then softened his tone. "And it isn't to their gossip." The next morning, he did the one thing he had avoided for years. He walked into the church on Sunday. The room went still in small ways. Heads turned. Whispering rose and fell like a breeze through dry grass. Anna stood near the back, clean but plainly dressed, hands clasped tight in front of her. She looked like she might bolt. After the service, the pastor greeted people at the front. Mr. Whitcomb stood nearby, smiling at anyone who mattered. When Caleb approached with Anna beside him, the smiles stiffened. Whitcomb stepped forward first, voice smooth and public. "Mr. Hart, how good to see you, and you've brought a friend." Anna started to step back, but Caleb kept his pace steady and his shoulders square. He looked at the pastor, then at Whitcomb, then at the townspeople gathering close enough to hear. "This is Anna Doyle," Caleb said, clear and even. "She works on my land. She earns her keep. She has done nothing wrong." A woman in the crowd tightened her mouth. Someone muttered, "It isn't proper." Another voice added, "A decent man wouldn't invite that." Whitcomb lifted his hands in a calm gesture. Now. No one is accusing anyone. We simply want what is best for the community." Caleb's eyes narrowed. Best for the community isn't forcing someone out because it makes you uncomfortable. The pastor shifted, uneasy. "Mr. Hart, perhaps this could be handled privately." Caleb shook his head. "No," he said, louder now. "Private is how people get pushed aside. If you want to judge, do it in daylight." Anna's breathing quickened. She looked at Caleb as if she couldn't believe he was doing this. Caleb kept his voice steady, but his hands trembled slightly at his sides. "I'm not asking anyone to like her," he said. "I'm telling you to treat her fairly, and I'm telling you that my choices are mine. If that costs me comfort, so be it." The crowd held its breath. Whitcomb's polite smile tightened into something hard. Caleb did not look away. In that moment, he chose honor over ease, and he did it where everyone could see. Weeks passed, and the ranch did not fall apart the way town talk promised it would. The sun kept rising. Cattle still needed water. Fences still leaned and had to be set straight. Life stayed practical, the way it always had, and that steadiness became its own quiet answer. Anna moved from the creek shelter to a small room off the barn at Caleb's insistence, but only after she set her own terms. She would pay her way with work. She would not be treated like a guest who owed smiles. Caleb agreed without argument, and that alone seemed to ease something in her. The first night she slept under a real roof, she didn't thank him again. She simply closed the door and breathed as if she had been holding her lungs tight for a long time. In the mornings, she was up before most of the hands. She learned the ranch routines fast. She scrubbed water buckets, helped men tack, and fed chickens with a steady focus. When Eli showed her how to check a fence line for breaks, she listened and asked smart questions. Nobody had to carry her. Nobody had to rescue her. She earned her place with sore muscles and quiet strength. At first, the ranch hands watched her like they were waiting for trouble. Tom was the most uncertain. He'd grown up in town and still worried about what people said there. But after he saw Anna lift a feed sack without complaint and walk it across the yard as if it weighed nothing, his attitude shifted. One afternoon, he offered her a pair of spare gloves without making a speech about it. Anna took them with a nod. Small things like that added up. Caleb noticed the changes in himself too, though he didn't speak of them. He ate more at dinner, not because food tasted better, but because he was no longer eating alone. He found himself fixing a loose step at the back porch and patching a drafty window in the kitchen, tasks he had ignored for years. It wasn't that Anna demanded a better home. It was that her presence made neglect harder to justify. Still, nothing turned easy overnight. The town's judgment didn't disappear. Some merchants stayed cold. Some neighbors rode past without waving. Mr. Whitcomb remained polite in the careful way that meant his kindness came with a price. But Caleb stopped flinching at it. He paid what he owed when he could, kept his accounts straight, and refused to beg for approval. Anna felt the pressure more than she admitted. Once, after returning from the store with supplies, she set the bag down too hard and turned away, blinking fast. Caleb didn't push her for details. He only said, "If you don't want to go into town, you don't have to." Anna shook her head. "If I hide, they win," she said. Her voice stayed calm, but her hands trembled a little. I'm tired of running. Caleb understood that tiredness in his bones. One late afternoon, they walked together out to the old creek site. The shelter still stood, but the tarp had faded and the boards had started to warp again. The prairie was reclaiming it, slow and certain. Anna stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at the space where she had slept on damp ground and listened to the wind for danger. I thought if I could just get one wall to stay up, she said quietly, everything would be fine. Caleb's eyes stayed on the leaning frame. It wasn't fine, he said. But you kept going. Anna glanced at him. So did you, she replied. They didn't talk about Mary often, but her absence was always there, like a chair left empty. One evening, Caleb surprised himself by taking down a small box from a high shelf in the closet and setting it on the kitchen table. Inside were a few of Mary's things, a ribbon, a sewing needle case, and a worn recipe card with her handwriting. Anna didn't reach for any of it. She just sat across from him and waited, letting him choose the pace. She used to sing while she worked, Caleb said after a long silence. His voice was steady, but his eyes were not. I used to think the house stopped breathing when she left. Anna nodded slowly. Grief doesn't leave, she said. It changes shape, or it turns you into someone you don't recognize. Caleb looked at the box, then at Anna. I didn't want to replace her, he said, the words heavy but honest. So I replaced everything else. I replaced feeling with work. I replaced hope with silence. Anna's throat moved as she swallowed. I'm not here to replace anyone, she said. I'm here because I want to live. Caleb's hands rested flat on the table. Then live here, he said. Not as an order, not as a rescue, as an offer. Anna held his gaze for a long moment. The old fear flickered in her face, the fear of trusting someone and paying for it later. Then she nodded once, small but sure. All right, she said. But we do it the right way. The right way, Caleb repeated. Over the next days, they made it practical. Anna's pay was set in writing with Eli as witness. Her work hours were clear. Her room was her own. She had a say in decisions that affected her. Caleb didn't hover. He didn't pretend she needed him for every step. That respect became the true foundation between them. The ranch began to feel different. Not loud, not perfect, but alive. Eli started staying for supper sometimes. Tom laughed more. Even the animals seemed calmer. Caleb caught himself standing at the kitchen window one morning, watching Anna in the yard as she hung laundry on a line, and he realized he was not bracing for loss the way he always did. He was simply watching, present, in the moment. One Saturday, Anna planted a small garden patch near the house. The soil was stubborn, full of stones, but she worked it patiently. Caleb brought her a shovel, and then, without thinking, knelt beside her to pull weeds. Their hands moved in the dirt, side by side, steady and equal. Later, as the light softened, Anna stood and wiped her forehead. You ever think, she said, that some people only know how to build with what's broken? Caleb looked out over the ranch, the fences, the barn, the house that no longer felt like a hollow shell. I did, he said, for a long time. Anna picked up one of the old warped boards they'd brought back from the creek, the one she had once tried to use as a wall. She carried it to the edge of the garden and laid it down as a border. Not as a support, not as a shelter, but as something harmless and finished. Then she turned to Caleb, her expression quiet but firm. We're not living on scraps anymore, she said. Caleb felt the words settle deep, not as a promise of perfect days, but as a choice they would keep making. He didn't reach for her hand like a storybook ending. He simply stood close enough that she didn't have to be alone, and she stayed close enough that he didn't have to be either. As the sun dipped low, the ranch looked the same as it always had from a distance. But inside its fences, something had shifted. Two people who had been holding themselves up on broken boards had finally built something that could carry weight. And if someone out there was listening to this and thinking they're too far gone, too judged, too tired, Caleb and Anna's story had one simple answer. The first real change didn't start with a grand moment. It started with being seen and choosing not to look away.